Hello and welcome back to this little series of videos where I am setting up for the first time a new kanna plane. Now, in the previous video I prepared the blade and the chip breaker. Now comes the slightly tricky job of fitting that properly to the die. Because inevitably I will go on a long waffle here. I'm going to start with the 2-minute version of how to do this. So we have our blade, bevel down, and in it goes. That's finger pressure, and I am quite a bit short of getting this blade to reach the mouth of the plane here. So what I want to do is get this so that with, let's say, 3 firm taps of the hammer, you never want to be wailing on this thing. It's just going to damage the die. It'll be a mess. So that's not what we're about here. But with 3 good taps of the hammer, I want this to be set in this die so that it's firm, so that there's no chatter when you take a shaving, and that the cutting edge is just at the mouth of the plane. How much you need to tap that in to get to that point is up to you, but that's how I want it. Just a few gentle taps to bring that blade into position so that it's almost ready to take a cut, but also firmly wedged in position so that it's not wobbling around there. Now, the way to do this is to mark this plane with graphite from a pencil, or you can use oil or something. You mark the back of the plane, also the sides, and then you tap that into position, and you can already see, I expect, that there's some marks on the back here, and this was done when this die was made. This is not from me. So where those dark marks are showing up, those are the high points on the die. So you take a chisel or a file or whatever you want, scrape those away until that blade seats nicely, and that's it. However, there are 1 or 2 little points about doing this that are worth thinking about, because it's never quite as straightforward as it first seems. And we want to do a good job of this, but that's the basic idea. Mark up the blade so you can see where the high points are, and then remove material off the bed of the plane here in order to get that to seat. Now, it may be that after some time and you've worn down the blade somewhat, that it's no longer a tight fit in here, or it may be that one makes a bit of a mess of it and removes too much material. This is not a disaster. You can take a small scrap of paper and cut a piece that fits nicely, just glue it on the bed of the plane, and that will then tighten this up. So this is quite easy to mess up, but it's also quite easy to fix. So that's the basic idea. Mark up the plane, trim off the high points, get the blade to fit. Now, what I thought I'd do in order to look at exactly what's going on here is if we take a look at how this part of the plane is actually made, the angles involved here, how the blade is fitted in place, then that gives a good understanding of what's going on, and consequently, when you come to fit a blade, you've got a better chance of doing a good job. So that requires pen and paper. So let's just start by I might as well do it on the exact dimensions of this plane. So I'm just marking the body there. Now, the blade is held in this part here, in these slots, and these are wedge shaped, and the blade is wedge shaped, and this is the only thing that grips it. Now the chip breaker sits here and is wedged against this pin, but the blade will be held in place firmly without the chip breaker being there. So if we look at the blade, it's going to be held bevel down, and the critical angle here is this one. This angle at the back is not particularly critical. You want to get that angle approximately right. You don't want it too shallow so that this edge is weak. And you also want to have clearance behind the cut. So what can happen is, as the plane rides over the wood, compressed fibres can spring back, and if there's not good clearance behind the cut, that can cause the plane to ride up and skip over the wood instead of cutting. So you don't want that. But with the plain blade sort of like that, you've got the clearance here at this angle, 12 to 15 degrees at least on there, and you want a sensible bevel angle here. 30 degrees would be fine, and that's going to leave plenty of material behind this cutting edge to make sure that that's reasonably resilient. But the bed angle is this one. It's got nothing to do with this part of the plane. It's this piece. So that is very often around 38 degrees. On this particular plane, it's a little bit closer, I think, to about 39. Now, for use on harder woods, you might set that to maybe 40 to 42, so slightly higher angles on the harder woods. So if I mark this at, what have I got that on? I've got that on 39 degrees, which is pretty much where this particular body happens to be cut at. Now this is an important point. If you specifically want a higher angle on the plane, you've got to look for a die that's being prepared that way, or then just take a chunk of suitable timber and prepare your own. So that's the critical cut, and that is this top part of the slot here. So that part, unless there's some sort of problem with the way it's being cut, and really it's unlikely that there is, but once you've checked that and you're happy with the way that's been cut, that part you do not touch. There's no need to adjust that part. Now the blade, as I said, is wedge shaped, so if we set this blade on the paper so that it's following that angle, and with the tip just down here, we can mark another line. And that is the other side of this groove. Now this groove may need to be adjusted this way. So when you fit the blade in, it may be that there's not enough gap here between the front of the groove and the back, and you may need to remove material here. This looks like it's been marked with pencil along the bottom of the groove on that side, not so much on this side. So it could be that I need to remove some material there. All the material we're removing is coming off of this face. So that's this part of the plane. If we just quickly look at how the other side works. So the edge of our blade is going to protrude here. So you're going to have a certain opening, and that's this part on the bottom, this part here. Depending on the sort of shaving you're taking, this opening, you might want this larger or smaller. Obviously it needs to be a little bit bigger than the shaving you're taking, the thickest shaving you want to take. So if you're configuring this for removing large amounts of material, this would be perhaps wider, and then you want that closed as close as possible for taking very thin shavings. And the reason being that the support that this corner of the plane gives to the the fibres being cut. The more support it gets here, the less likely you are to get some tear out. Now, this part of the plane, this is not so critical, this surface. It's often around sort of 60 degrees. On this particular one, I've just measured it. It's about 57 across there, from here to here. That angle's not that critical. But what you might be able to notice down the bottom, there's another part here. I don't know what that's called on a Japanese plane, but I think on Western planes we tend to call that the wear. So that goes up at a steeper angle to start with, and then I've got this set already at the angle of the rest of that slope there. So let's just draw that in. So if you just had this come down at this sort of angle here, as soon as you start to flatten the sole, and you have to periodically re-flatten the sole, you're going to very quickly walk up this slope, and you're going to widen this mouth here. So to avoid that, this wear is cut. It's not cut at the same angle as the bed here, but it's a little bit wider to allow the chip to clear. But otherwise, this angle is rather closer to this angle of the blade, so that as you progressively wear back the sole, this mouth doesn't suddenly get too wide. So that's the main geometry of that opening there. So one thing you might notice is that the bed here is not flat. So there's a curve that runs across it this way. And don't be tempted when first picking this up to try and true this up and make it flat, because the blade, when it's sat in that bed that way, across the back here, this is typically a little bit dished. And you can put a straight edge across it. I'm afraid this won't show on the camera, but sure enough, there is a curve to the blade there. So if you did flatten this, the contact on the blade's only going to be on the outside. And the idea when preparing this bed is to have the best possible contact we can arrange between this surface and the back of the blade. And we want that to be as widespread as possible so that the blade doesn't move when taking a shaving. You're not going to get any chatter. So that's quite important. Now, there is something funny going on with these grooves, and although you won't need to touch that top part of the groove there, the bit that sets the bed angle, you may need to do some adjustment on the side. So if we take a look at the blade, and this does vary from blade to blade, but there is typically a taper running, not only is it wedge shaped this way, but there's a taper running down the length of the blade. So if I check at the top, what have I got there? At 66.4, and down near the cutting edge, I'm on 65.4. So I've got 1 millimeter of taper along the length of the blade. Now, what you want to see in the slot, if we just look at these grooves, see, this is the top of that's the top of the plane here. Now, when this is sat in the body, we need to be able to adjust the blade angle like so. Obviously I'm exaggerating it. If you don't have any adjustment this way, this lateral adjustment, on a metal body plane, you probably got a lever that will perform that adjustment for you. But if you don't have that adjustment and the plane blade is not coming out perfectly square, you're going to be taking a cut off one side and not off the other. So that facility is quite important. Now, if this blade is jammed tight in this groove, you're not going to have the facility to adjust the blade. Now the taper on that blade helps, so we have a small clearance, 0.5 mil each side, if that is pinched near the top, but we want a slightly more than that. So the sides of this groove, that can be square, but we'll have slightly more clearance down the bottom here than we do at the top. Now we don't want this quite pinching, but if we've got 0.5 mil, say, each side, that's going to give us scope to nicely adjust this in position. So when the blade is set down, in order to make that lateral adjustment, you tap with the hammer one way or the other. With a bit of practice, this is quite a simple adjustment. And then once that's set at the right angle, it doesn't tend to drift too much. It's pretty good. So that is the trick with those grooves. So although we don't want to touch this top surface, we will need to trim, in all likelihood, a little bit off the bottom of the groove, and we may need to make some adjustments to make sure there is clearance down the side of the blade. As I said, it is helped by the fact that there's a taper on the blade, but we want to make sure that we're able to make that sort of lateral adjustment. If the blade is wedged tight in the top, you're not going to be able to adjust that for an even cut. So if we look on the bottom of the plane here, you can see this two flats. That's the bottom of the groove that's holding the blade in place. Now on the blade itself, you have these angles cut on the side. Now there's nothing particularly critical about these angles, except one important point is that this blade width here, the cutting width, that wants to match with the gap here, the distance between the shoulders of the groove. If the cutting part is protruding into this groove, what tends to happen is shavings get jammed in the corners, and then it's a job to clear them out. So to make sure that doesn't happen, you make sure that the blade width at the cutting edge is within that slot there, and also you can cut a little bit of extra clearance here if need be to help shavings clear. Now I'm just looking at this plane, and I mean it's very close. It's very close. So it won't be long before I have to adjust these, and possibly I need to take just a little bit off of these. I'll see how it is in action. What sometimes happens when you make that lateral adjustment, you end up with one corner of the blade interfering with the bottom of the slot there, and then you get those shavings stuck. But as you grind back with successive honing of the blade, these little ears on the corner are going to disappear. So you have to periodically just take those corners off. You don't have to do anything clever with them, just the coarsest, a coarse diamond plate is pretty good for doing that. It doesn't have to be anything of particular quality. You're not touching the cutting edge or the bevel really. So just making sure that the width of this doesn't get too big. So that is it for a normal body of a plane. I think that's all the important points with respect to fitting the blade. However, this blade has this tsumi. Now this is an extra ledge of material down the bottom, so this plane is not consistent all the way to the bottom. There's a change of angle here. So if we have a look again at how the blade is fitted, it doesn't matter what angle I put this down at. If I just sketch the orientation off of this blade, So normally the bed that we're going to adjust will follow the plain blade on the back down in this one continuous angle right down to here, and the plane will be open behind the blade. So if we look on here, we see the back of the bevel here for quite a long stretch, and that's fine. It's not a problem. However, this ledge is known as tsumi, and what's happened here is that this body has been cut with another angle so that the bed is two planes like so. Now, what this is intended to do, or the idea as far as I understand it, is that it's thought that if you can provide better support along the entire length of the plain blade here and to this beveled part, then you're less likely to have any chatter whilst planing. Now, there are a couple of problems with this, and personally I'm not a fan. It doesn't make any sense to me. Now, the adjustment that one makes here in order to affect the depth of cut, it's not huge. However, it seems to me that there will be a perfect depth of cut that matches the tsumi correctly, and if you push this blade down further, what happens is that this then bulges out behind the blade, and that can cause all sorts of problems with the cut. And it can also, if you just take one of these blades and just whack it in too hard, it can cause cracking on the side of the plane. This will be bowed out on the bottom, and it's just a disaster. The other thing is that you can see from this geometry, and this is exactly the geometry I've got in this plane, this angle here is pretty acute. So this piece of wood here, this is rather weak, and it won't be long before this starts to get mashed up in use. It's also the case that as we condition the sole and we take that back, this is very quickly going to start getting worn away. The important point with this is that this makes fitting the blade a lot more difficult. So normally with the blade here, you mark the back with the pencil, mark the sides, wedge it in, and then you can see these dirty marks showing the high points. Well, now I've got to also go across the bevel, and I've got to be ever so careful as I tap this in, because if I start beating on this when it's in close proximity to the tsumi, I am going to cause some damage, and the last thing I want to do is crack the bottom of this plane. I've got to be honest, I am rather tempted just to remove it, and it's not that hard to do. I already have the correct angle here. I can come down and just continue that and remove that tsumi, and then I've got a standard plain body. It's a lot easier to set up and fiddle with. But for now, I'm going to retain it. I'll see how I get on with it, and if it annoys me too much, I will take a chisel to it and remove it. No harm will otherwise be done to the plane by doing so. I'm just going to turn it back into an ordinary body then. So I think that is it for the waffle. I now need to get on and do the job. So in order to make the adjustments to the plane, I'm going to be using chisels mainly, possibly also I've got a couple of small files here if I need them. They can be handy for working in those slots. It's also dead handy if you've got a skinny chisel, 3mm, 1/8 of an inch, whatever, something thin like that will fit down those slots. On a chunky blade like this chisel has lots of clearance. On some of the smaller planes, like this little effectively block plane, that slot is pretty small, but still the 3mm chisel will fit, and that is really rather handy. Now, during the process of fitting this blade, I'm going to need to be removing it a lot, and as I explained in a previous video, you do that by striking the back edge of the plane here, and I've already done it a couple of times. If I don't do something with this, there's every chance I'm going to splinter this wood and make a mess of it. Because this plane hasn't been set up before, these edges are still crisp, and what I want here is a decent sized chamfer. I'm going to put a small chamfer on now, and that's the first thing I'm going to do, just so I don't damage this when I'm continually putting in and taking the blade out. Now I will chamfer along here later, so if there's a little bit of tear out here, it's not a big deal, but I'll try and avoid it, playing from both sides. Just taking a very fine shaving, nice little curls there. And I can work the other side as well. And it's a little bit unfortunate that there's so much marking here from the fitting of this blade before, but I'm just going to give that just a little bit of a rub down, just with this little bit of scrap of sandpaper. I imagine that when I fit the blade, it's going to mark this in exactly the same place, but just to be certain, I don't want to be removing material where it's not necessary, so I'll take some of these marks off, and I'm really not removing anything except just a little bit of that graphite. I don't have to remove much to be able to see whether it's fresh or old stuff, but that way I can be certain that it's from my own fitting of the blade and not something left over from before. So that's not perfect, but it's removed a little bit of that. So I am now going to quite heavily cover this with graphite. And I'm going to keep topping this up as I go along. I want an even coverage. On the sides, so I can see whether it's binding in the slot anywhere. Make sure we've got that clearance for lateral adjustment. And also across the bevel, although I doubt very much when I'm going to be getting anywhere near the tsumi anytime soon. So now I can fit the blade. Now when I'm doing it, I'm trying to make sure it's as central as possible. Then I can give it a tap. Tap it with a metal hammer. If you do that, eventually you start to dome over the top of the soft iron here. And that's why when you look at old planes, they're all beaten up on the top. If you don't want to do that, you can use a wooden mallet. I have to say, I quite like the mallet for removing the blade, but there's something quite nice about the positive feel of the hammer when setting it. So that's pretty much wedged in now. A couple of taps to free it. And yeah, we can see a pattern of graphite, so there's quite a bit up here, and that is pretty much where it was before. There's a lot further down. That area that I sanded off, that doesn't have too much. There's a little bit here, so I'm glad I did sand that back a little bit. So that needs to be just gradually worked out. I'm just going to take tiny amounts off. It doesn't matter how long this takes, but I would rather take a tiny amount, refit it, and then just keep going in a cycle. until I've got it right. And of course I'm nowhere near the tsumi. I think I've got about that far down here, so I've got a long way to go. Well, my workshop here is rather poorly equipped at the moment, so I'm improvising some work holding solutions, and it is nice if you can get this plane reasonably steady when working on it. It's a lot safer. Don't want it sliding around. Don't really want to squeeze it in a vise either, as that can distort the body while you're working on it. So I've just got this bit of scrap wood, a couple of bits of scrap across it that fit the plane nicely. In this direction at least, that is nice and solid. I've got it clamped to the bench so I can work at this quite safely. So all I'm going to do, I've got no sign of anything on the sides of the slots here, so that is pretty good. I think I've got sufficient clearance for lateral adjustment, so I think I just need to work on the bed here. This slot is tight, this side not so much, maybe just a little down the bottom. So all I'm going to do with the chisel is take some very fine shavings off, and these will be very fine. Just want to remove all the graphite that I see, and then once that's removed I will reinsert the blade and then work on it again. Now this is slightly awkward. It would be very nice to pare down this face here, because this is flat, this is not, so it's a tricky thing to work on, but I'm sort of half paring, half scraping. I'm not being too fussy, just want to remove the graphite patches that I see. Now if you go mad at this, you can quite quickly go too far, and that I do not want to do. I would rather fit this 20 times and creep up on my target. There's a little bit here. I'm taking the smallest amount off that I can manage, really, because that way I'm going to get the closest fit between the bed and the back of the plane, which is what I want. It's a little bit tricky up the top here. So that's all you could be able to see from the camera angle, but there's a little bit more just down here. I'm just looking down those slots now. There is just a little bit, I'm not including this mark here because I can see the clearance at the top. I will check that as I get the blade seated further down because of that taper, but I can see just a little bit in that slot. Before I go any further, I'm going to drop the blade back in, see how we're getting on. You can keep an eye here, it's easier to see how far we got to go. We've got a long way to go, but just gently tapping it. I do not want to whack that. Let's have a look. So there's a little bit more up the top and more off the bed there. But some of those areas that I scraped away before, they're no longer marked. So this is the game. We're going to carry on just slightly scraping, paring and scraping. I'm taking just such a tiny amount off. It's not really a shaving. And I'm going to sneak up on that fit. And each time I do it, I'm going to look very carefully at the tsumi to see any marks down here. Because what I don't want to do is be beating that in this way without clearing the tsumi. I don't want to crack the body or bow out the bottom. Now, every now and then, I want to charge up the graphite on here, make sure it is properly loaded. You can feel, if you're just tapping it gently, you can feel when it starts to firm up there. Okay, so my clearance at the top is very much reduced now. There's 0.5 mil here and it's pinching there, so I think I will need to make some adjustment at the top of the slot now, because I've lost a little of that. There we go. Yeah, so I've got marks now at the top here and on this side, just along there and a little bit down the bottom. So more work to do. I've got a slightly different pattern now across here, and well, I'm just going to carry on. I'll very carefully try and pare away here. See, I can see where the saw kerf has cut a little deeper. When this is made, 2 saw cuts are made for the groove and then the waste chiseled out. I can see that the kerf is a little bit deeper on one side. But I'll just clear a bit more of that waste out. Give a bit more clearance for the top of the blade. Yeah, I can get a slightly larger chisel in here. Well, I think I am down to the tsumi here, and I'm not that far from setting this blade in the right place, but actually when I'm tapping it, I hear quite a dull sound when you get down to the tsumi, and that's telling me that I've hit something solid. So now right down the bottom I can just start to see a faint line of graphite. Again, I'm still working on this bed bit by bit as I go. I've got fairly good coverage all over the place. Taking very small shavings off, this still feels very smooth. Now, there may well be an intended tool for this job. Whatever it is, I don't have it. I'm just going to take one of the smaller chisels and get down there and just scrape away at the tsumi where I see the graphite, and that is going to have to do. Now, it's interesting, that blade is so close here now. Really do get a feel for just how thin this wood is here. I really don't see much point in it myself, but it is what it is. It's there, so I'm going to have to deal with it. I've also got a little bit of graphite showing up just here, so I'm going to trim that from this side. Now I probably can't get one of these chisels down there. Oh, maybe I can, but if not, I've got a very thin file here. I can work at that patch and just tidy up the bottom of the grooves there. So as I work on this, I'll scrape back the tsumi where it's marked, and it won't be long before I am level with the base here. Well, I finally have this blade in place, and I mean, it's quite solidly bedded there now. I can feel it when I tap it, it's solid. But if I sight down the plane here, I can see that there is just an edge of the blade sticking up. And by the time I've leveled this sole off here, I'll have plenty of adjustment. There is a small gap each side here, 1/2 mil. Yeah, about 1/2 mil. So that's enough for the lateral adjustment. And I can see if I just give it a little tap on one side, then the other, I can see that blade moving, so it's not being pinched in there. I will have the adjustment that I need. It's not excessive, the amount there, for sure. And now if I remove the blade, and again, all across the base there, it's covered in graphite. A fairly even covering, and that means I should have pretty good support for the blade all across there. I'm not seeing much on the tsumi. As it happens, that this rough surface here, that takes the graphite really well. Not so much the bevel itself. However, I think it's in contact there, but it's not jammed up so tight that I won't be able to adjust it a little bit. Critically, no cracking on the bottom here, no bulging out when I set that blade down there. So as far as the blade is concerned, I'm going to leave that right now. It's possible that after a while I will make some tiny little adjustment to it. I'll see how it is in use. What I'm going to do in the next video is condition the sole, finish off the chamfering of the body, and then give it a try. The last thing for this video is to look at the chip breaker. So if I set the blade in place, yeah, you can definitely feel when that is bedding down on the tsumi there. But I've got the blade in place. Now I want to see how the chip breaker fits. So I'm just going to slide that in with some care, and I want to see how tight that is. I mean, that is fairly tight. I want to just see whether I can tap this chip breaker down. It's quite tight. I'm looking across the pin here now. I want to see what sort of contact there is here. Now, ideally, you want good contact all across that pin so that it's being held nicely. Very often, it's not perfect contact. It might just be held in a couple of places or in the middle. It's not great, but this one it's tight all the way along. So that's ideal. It is a little bit tight, and there are two options here. I can file down the back of the pin, and if it's pinching in one place and not somewhere else, that's a good way to do it. The other option is to adjust the end of the chip breaker here, and I know I already sort of temporarily adjusted this so that it mated with the blade nicely. I did that in the previous video. I could just flatten those little ears on the back of the chip breaker, and that will give me just a little more clearance here. I think this is just a wee bit tighter than I ideally want. So I'm going to do that. And it's good to have to pinch the blade and the chip breaker together when you're removing it. Last thing you want to do is drop it, especially in here. I've got a concrete floor. Eventually I will have some kind of tiles down here, softer material, but until that happens I have to be really careful with anything bladed like that. It'd be a disaster to drop it. Right, so on my impromptu anvil here, I can just give these ears a bit of a tap. Now, each time I do that, I need to make sure that they're sitting nicely on the blade again. Okay, I need to adjust that. I need to tap this one a little bit. Yeah, that's fine. So I've obviously moved that slightly, and I'll just try that back in the body. Right, that's nearly there. In we go. Right, that is very close to the right position. There is a bit of a bow in the pin still. I think for now I am going to leave that. Whether I make any changes or not, I can do those later. There's great contact between the pin and the chip breaker, so I'm kind of happy with it. And I mean, this now could be adjusted to make a shaving, but of course this is not being prepared, so it wouldn't be doing very well. So I think the blade and the chip breaker, they're at least 95% there. Maybe there'll be a little bit of fettling left to do when I start trying it out, but I will return in the next video, finish off the work on the body, and we'll give it a try, see whether I've done a good job or not. But that is all for this one. Thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.